Dave Mendez stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror of the human embassy on Centauri Prime and wondered, not for the first time, how his life had come to this particular moment. He adjusted his regulation translator's uniform, a hideous navy blue monstrosity with silver piping that made him look like a rejected bellhop from a 1980s sci-fi show. 27 Earth languages, he muttered to himself, running a hand through his perpetually disheveled dark hair. 7 years at the Xenolinguistic Academy, or alien languages mastered. And for what? Going to be the galaxy's most overqualified coffee fetcher. The bathroom door whooshed open, revealing Terry Michaels, Dave's supervisor and the walking embodiment of bureaucratic mediocrity. Mendez, there you are. Been looking everywhere. Dave suppressed a sigh. Just freshening up before the Arcturian trade delegation arrives, sir. Change of plans. The Arcturians have postponed, again. Terry's face had taken on an unusual pallor. But the vrax'thi High Command has arrived 12 hours ahead of schedule. Dave felt the blood drain from his face. The vrax'thi? As in the militaristic, 7-foot-tall mantis-like aliens who consider lateness a capital offense? Those vrax'thi? The very same, Terry confirmed, sweat beading on his forehead. And Lucinda, our senior vrax'thi and translator, chose this particular moment to go into labor with triplets. Congratulations to her, Dave said automatically. Then the implications hit him. Wait, no, absolutely not. You're the only other translator who's even attempted their language. I've been studying it for 8 months. Their language has 14 tonal variations and 23 grammatical genders. I'm barely conversational. Terry grabbed Dave's shoulders with surprising strength for a man whose primary exercise was shuffling papers. Listen to me. This is the most important diplomatic meeting since first contact 15 years ago. The vrax'thi control access to 90% of the quantum-stabilized dilithium in the sector. If we don't get this treaty signed, Earth remains at the bottom of the galactic resource chain for another decade. Dave tried to calculate how quickly he could reach the nearest exit. But, no, Vaughn. The human diplomatic corps needs you, Dave. Terry's eyes bore into his with unsettling intensity. Earth needs you. That's emotional manipulation and you know it, Dave grumbled. Is it working? Dave sighed deeply. What time is the meeting? It started 5 minutes ago. And that's how Dave Mendez, perpetually underpaid and catastrophically underappreciated linguist, found himself sprinting through the gleaming corridors of the embassy, clutching his ancient datapad containing hastily downloaded vrax'thi and dictionaries, cultural notes, and a half-finished primer on their impenetrable caste based on honorifics. As he skidded to a halt outside the main conference room, Dave took one last, desperate breath and pushed through the doors. The room fell silent as every head human and decidedly not human turned to stare at him. Ah, and here is our translator now, announced Ambassador Elena Ortega with forced joviality. Everyone, this is David Mendez, one of our most versatile linguists. Dave scanned the room. On one side sat the human delegation, 4 diplomats in their finest attire, looking like they'd just been told the restaurant was out of their favorite dish. On the other side, literally perched 7 vrax'thi officials, their mantis-like bodies perfectly still, and compound eyes reflecting the room's lights in disconcerting prismatic patterns. I apologize for my tardiness, Dave said, then repeated the phrase in halting vrax'thian, but careful to use the formal caste inflection and the appropriate clicking mandible gesture with his hand. The largest vrax'thi, easily 8 feet tall with carapace markings that indicated either high military rank or a nasty skin condition, tilted its head at an angle that Dave's limited cultural training suggested was either moderate interest or imminent violent rage. You are the replacement translator? The vrax'thi's voice sounded like gravel in a blender, its translator device rendering the clicks and whistles into stilted English. Yes, exalted combat superior, Dave replied, hoping he'd identified the correct rank. The mantis alien's mandibles clacked in what might have been amusement. Interesting. The last human who attempted our language suffered a minor cerebral hemorrhage. Dave swallowed hard. Well, I always did have a thick skull. As he took his seat at the translator's console, Dave caught Ambassador Ortega's desperate glance. The message was clear: don't screw this up. Too late, Dave thought. The screwing up had already begun the moment he'd agreed to pursue xenolinguistics instead of his father's suggestion of accounting. The vrax'thi delegation was, in a word, terrifying. Their species had evolved from mantis-like predators, and despite achieving interstellar travel and allegedly enlightened diplomacy, they still looked like they were one bad day away from eating their negotiating partners. "We shall commence with the formal acknowledgments," announced the largest vrax'thi. "I am Grand Admiral Korg, Supreme Military Commander of the 7th vrax'thi Battle Fleet and Keeper of the Sacred Hunting Grounds of vrax'thi Prime." Dave's fingers flew over his console, desperately searching for the correct honorifics. The vrax'thi language had a charming quirk where using the wrong honorific could either imply sexual attraction or a challenge to mortal combat. Neither seemed appropriate for interplanetary diplomacy. "The Grand Admiral welcomes you and extends the sacred hunting rights of his ancestors," Dave translated to the human delegation, while silently praying he hadn't just offered them up as ritual sacrifices. Ambassador Ortega nodded graciously. "Please tell the Grand Admiral that Earth is honored by his presence and looks forward to a productive dialogue regarding resource-sharing agreements." Dave translated, careful to use the proper formal clicks. Admiral Korg's antenna twitched a good sign? Bad sign? Dave had no idea. "The ambassador expresses Earth's gratitude for your magnificence and hopes you find our planet suitable for future hunting expeditions," translated the vrax'thi's own interpreter, a smaller, greener individual introduced as sub-translator Zik. Dave blinked. That wasn't what Ortega had said at all. Before he could interject, Ortega was nodding along pleasantly, unaware of the mistranslation. Over the next hour, Dave watched with growing alarm as nearly everything the humans said was subtly twisted by Zik. Meanwhile, the vrax'thi's statements came through increasingly aggressive and demanding. The treaty terms originally meant to be mutually beneficial were rapidly becoming a one-sided resource grab. The human diplomats were clearly out of their depth. Ambassador Ortega kept smiling and nodding. Trade Minister Jackson was sweating through his expensive suit, and the two junior diplomats looked like they were mentally updating their resumes. During a brief recess, Dave cornered Ortega near the refreshment table. "Ambassador, I think there's something wrong with their translator. He's deliberately mistranslating both sides to increase tension." Ortega gave him a condescending smile. "Mr. Mendez, I appreciate your concern, but sub-translator Zik comes highly recommended. He's been facilitating vrax'thi human communications for 3 years. But he just translated your statement about mutual prosperity as willing submission." "Perhaps it's a cultural nuance you're not familiar with," Ortega suggested, patting his arm like he was an eager child. "Remember, you're only here as backup. Let the professionals handle this." Dave watched helplessly as Ortega rejoined the group. Across the room, Admiral Korg was staring directly at him with those unsettling compound eyes. The vrax'thi's mandibles clicked softly as he leaned down to whisper something to Zik, who shot Dave a look that transcended species barriers. The message was clear: stay in your lane. When the negotiations resumed, the atmosphere had grown even more tense. The vrax'thi were now demanding exclusive mining rights to Jupiter's moons, a major concession not previously on the table. "The Grand Admiral expresses concern that your species lacks the technological sophistication to properly extract quantum-stabilized dilithium," Zik translated smoothly. "For safety reasons, vrax'thi oversight is necessary." Dave's datapad showed a very different translation. "Your pathetic species will surrender the Jupiter territories or face eradication. We have been patient long enough. Tell the Grand Admiral we're certainly open to technological cooperation," Ortega replied cheerfully. Before Zik could twist her words again, Dave cleared his throat loudly. "Actually, Ambassador, the Grand Admiral just threatened to eradicate humanity if we don't surrender Jupiter's moons." The room fell silent. Ortega laughed nervously. "I'm sure that's just a translation error on your part, Mr. Mendez." Admiral Korg's enormous form rose from his chair, mandibles spread wide in what Dave recognized as a dominance display. "Your junior translator is either very brave or very stupid," he clicked in his native tongue. Dave, running entirely on linguistic instinct and what could generously be called a death wish, responded directly in vrax'thi. "Perhaps I am stupid enough to be brave, Admiral. Or perhaps brave enough to appear stupid when necessary." The Admiral's compound eyes seemed to widen slightly, the vrax'thi equivalent of shock. Then he did something unexpected. He laughed, a terrifying sound like metal being torn apart. "I begin to see why your species has survived despite your obvious weaknesses," Korg said, now speaking perfect English. "You occasionally produce individuals with actual spinal structures." Every human in the room gaped at him. "You speak English?" Ortega finally managed. "I speak 17 languages," Korg replied dismissively. "I find it useful to understand what my enemies are actually saying, rather than what my subordinates claim they are saying." He fixed his gaze on Zik, who seemed to shrink several inches. Dave suddenly realized he might have just stumbled into or possibly created an interspecies incident of catastrophic proportions. The diplomatic chamber had transformed from merely tense to what Dave's grandfather would have called a Mexican standoff with extra steps. Ambassador Ortega was frantically trying to salvage the situation. Minister Jackson looked like he was calculating the blast radius of an interstellar diplomatic incident, and the junior diplomats had achieved a shade of pale previously unknown to medical science. Grand Admiral, Ortega began, visibly struggling to maintain her composure. "There seems to have been some confusion in our communications. Perhaps we should take another brief recess too." "There is no confusion," Admiral Korg interrupted, still standing at his full, intimidating height. "Your translator detected deception, while your senior diplomat," he gestured at Ortega, with a razor-sharp foreclaw, "ignored the warning. This tells me much about how humans conduct their affairs." Dave felt every human eye in the room boring into him like laser drills. "Great job, Mendez," he thought. "Day 1 as a senior translator, and you've managed to torpedo humanity's most important treaty since first contact." "If I may," Dave said, surprising even himself by speaking up, "I believe this presents an opportunity rather than a setback." Korg's antenna twitched. "Explain." "In human culture, we have a saying, 'Cards on the table.' It means to proceed with complete honesty, hiding nothing." Dave took a deep breath. "Perhaps we could restart these negotiations with direct translation between yourself and Ambassador Ortega, with both translators cross-checking each other's work." The vrax'thi Admiral made that terrible metal-tearing sound again. Laughter, Dave reminded himself. "Your suggestion has merit, language human Dave. But I would amend it. I will speak directly in your English. You will translate for your delegation when I speak in vrax'thi. My subordinate Zik will remain silent unless spoken to." Zik's exoskeleton seemed to pale several shades. And Korg continued, mandibles spreading in what Dave recognized as the vrax'thi equivalent of a predatory smile. "We shall discuss why exactly your translator's cortical implant contains a direct communication link to the Aurelian embassy." All eyes swiveled to Zik, who began making high-pitched clicking sounds that required no translation. They were the universal sound of someone caught red-handed. "The Aurelians?" Minister Jackson finally sputtered. "But they're your traditional rivals in the sector." "Indeed," Korg said dryly. "How very coincidental that they would wish to monitor and possibly influence negotiations that could strengthen Earth's position as a vrax'thi rather than an Aurelian one." The pieces clicked into place in Dave's mind. They've been playing both sides, mistranslating to ensure the treaty fails. A rudimentary but occasionally effective tactic, Korg acknowledged. One that would have succeeded if not for your linguistic skills and your inexplicable human tendency to speak when silence would be more advantageous to your continued existence. Coming from a vrax'thi, Dave realized, this was practically a glowing compliment. The negotiations resumed with a decidedly different tone, with Zik removed from the translation loop and placed under guard in what the humans politely called a separate waiting area, and the vrax'thi more accurately termed a pre-execution holding chamber. The communication flowed more smoothly. However, the damage had been done. Both sides were now deeply suspicious. The treaty terms were in disarray, and Dave found himself in the excruciating position of trying to navigate complex diplomatic language he'd never been trained for. The breaking point came during discussion of mining rights in the asteroid belt. A simple misunderstanding about resource allocation percentages. Dave had confused the vrax'thi in words for shared access with surrendered claim caused Admiral Korg to rise from his seat in fury. This is precisely why dealing with pre-spacefaring species is inefficient. He clicked rapidly in vrax'thi, too quickly for Dave to properly translate. Your kind barely understands basic gravitational physics, let alone quantum resource management. Dave struggled to keep up. The Admiral expresses concerns about our understanding of the resource extraction processes. Tell them exactly what I said, translator Dave, Korg demanded in English. I wish them to understand the full measure of my frustration. Dave swallowed hard. He basically called us primitive apes who don't understand how gravity works. Ambassador Ortega's diplomatic smile froze in place. I see. Erisa. Furthermore, Korg continued, switching back to his native tongue, inform your delegation that the High Command is questioning the value of this alliance. Perhaps the Aurelians were correct. Humans are too volatile, too unpredictable to be trusted with advanced technologies. As Dave translated this latest bombshell, he noticed something odd about Korg's speech pattern. The Admiral was using an obscure dialectical form that Dave had only encountered in his studies of ancient vrax'thi and military texts, a form typically reserved for testing the mettle of subordinates. Was this a test? And if so, of what? The negotiation room had emptied for an emergency recess, leaving Dave alone with his thoughts and his increasingly desperate internet searches on how to save interspecies relations and fastest routes to witness protection programs. Neither search was yielding helpful results. You look troubled, language human Dave. Dave nearly jumped out of his skin. Admiral Korg had somehow entered the room, silently impressive for an 8-foot mantis alien with chitinous leg plates. Admiral. I didn't hear you come in. Obviously. Korg's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. Your species relies too heavily on auditory input. It makes you easy to approach or to hunt. That's comforting, Dave replied, wondering if this was how his career and possibly life would end alone in a conference room with an apex predator from another world. Korg tilted his head. You recognized the dialectical challenge form in my speech earlier. A few of my own junior officers would have caught that subtlety. Dave blinked in surprise. You noticed that I noticed? I notice everything, language human Dave, including the fact that sub-translator Zik was not the only one in this delegation with outside communication. Dave's blood ran cold. I don't understand. Korg's compound eyes reflected the room's light in fractal patterns. 3 of your human diplomats have received encrypted communications during our negotiations. My sensory apparatus detects the frequencies. That could be normal diplomatic chatter, Dave suggested weakly. Perhaps. Korg extended a foreclaw and tapped Dave's datapad. Or perhaps not. Access Security Protocol Epsilon 9 on your embassy system. I don't have clearance for security protocols. Use override code, Delta Sierra Charlie 749, Korg said calmly. Dave stared at him. How do you have access codes to our systems? Your government gave them to me 12 of your Earth hours ago, when we detected an Aurelian infiltration attempt. The question is not how I have them, but why your ambassador does not appear to be aware of this security breach. Against his better judgment, Dave input the code. His datapad immediately displayed classified communications between Minister Jackson and what appeared to be Aurelian diplomatic accounts. Holy shit, Dave whispered, scrolling through the messages. They're planning to sabotage the treaty. Jackson's been promised a position as Earth's governor under Aurelian oversight. A classic divide-and-conquer strategy, Korg observed. The Aurelians wished to ensure that if their translation sabotage failed, they had a backup plan. We have to tell Ambassador Ortega. Ambassador Ortega has been compromised as well, Korg replied matter-of-factly. Though she is unaware. Her aide is feeding her false information about vrax'thi intentions. Dave's mind raced. So both sides have been manipulated into distrust by the Aurelians. But why tell me? I'm just a translator. Are you? Korg's antennae twitched forward, a sign of intense focus. Your file suggests otherwise. Graduated top of your class at the Xenolinguistic Academy. Turned down positions at 3 major interstellar corporations. Requested assignment to diplomatic services, despite the lower prestige and salary. You've read my file? Dave asked weakly. I read everyone's file. Korg moved closer, his enormous frame casting Dave in shadow. Your psychological profile indicates high integrity and an unusual lack of personal ambition. In vrax'thi culture, these would be considered defects. In this situation, however, they make you valuable. Dave suddenly understood. You need someone who isn't compromised, someone who can expose the plot without being dismissed as having ulterior motives. Precisely. But why would anyone believe me? I'm the junior translator who almost caused an interspecies incident this morning. Sometimes, Korg said, mandibles clicking softly, the best weapon is the one your enemy believes is harmless. Dave looked down at his datapad, then back up at the towering alien. What's your plan? Not my plan. Our plan. Korg's compound eyes glittered. And it begins with you doing what humans do best, creating complete chaos while thinking you're helping. As the alien outlined his strategy, Dave felt a curious mixture of terror and exhilaration. He was about to either save interstellar relations or become the human who single-handedly started the first human vrax'thi war. Just another Tuesday in the life of an underpaid translator. Dave stood in the center of the reconvened diplomatic chamber, sweating profusely under the combined gaze of the human delegation, the vrax'thi officials, and the newly arrived Aurelian observers, sleek, dolphin-like aliens whose perpetual smiles now seemed more menacing than friendly. Mr. Mendez, Ambassador Ortega said icily, you called this emergency session claiming to have critical information. We're all waiting. Dave cleared his throat. Yes, well, first I'd like to apologize for my inexperience in any cultural friction I may have caused earlier. Admiral Korg's antennae twitched slightly, the signal they had agreed upon. Phase 1. Appear harmless. While reviewing my translation notes, Dave continued, I discovered some fascinating linguistic parallels between vrax'thi and military dialects and certain Aurelian diplomatic phrases. So I took the liberty of compiling a comparative analysis. He connected his datapad to the room's projection system. The holographic display showed what appeared to be a mundane linguistic comparison chart, utterly boring to anyone except the most dedicated xenolinguist. Riveting, Minister Jackson said dryly. Is there a point to this academic exercise? Absolutely, Dave replied with forced cheerfulness. You see, when certain phony patterns are isolated and cross-referenced with standard encryption algorithms. He tapped his datapad, and the display transformed. What had appeared to be linguistic notes rearranged themselves to reveal communication logs between Jackson, Ortega's aide, and the Aurelian diplomatic corps. The room erupted into chaos. This is outrageous, Jackson shouted, rising to his feet. I assure you this is some sort of mistake, the lead Aurelian diplomat burbled through his translator. Dave raised his voice above the commotion. Ambassador Ortega, with all due respect, you've been deliberately misinformed about vrax'thi intentions by your own staff. Minister Jackson has been in direct communication with the Aurelians, negotiating a separate deal that would effectively make Earth a client state. Ortega's face had gone from diplomatic calm to thunderous rage in seconds. These are serious accusations, Mr. Mendez. If you're wrong. He is not wrong, Admiral Korg interrupted, rising to his full height. The vrax'thi High Command authorized me to share this information with translator Dave when we detected Aurelian interference. We wished to test whether humanity could identify treachery within its own ranks. Phase 2 complete. Now for the hard part. Dave took a deep breath and launched into what Korg had called the linguistic nuclear option. Krek the nav poiesh krieke thon malakti vrek nor. He proclaimed in perfect high vrax'thi, a formal declaration invoking the ancient right of truth speaking before combat. The vrax'thi delegation's reaction was immediate. They rose as one, mandibles spread wide in the traditional response to the ritual challenge. Admiral Korg's eyes gleamed with what might have been approval. The human translator has invoked the right of H-Cree. By our most ancient laws, he now has the right to speak uninterrupted, and his words must be judged on their merit alone. Dave had exactly one chance to get this right. The ritual he'd invoked was rarely used even among the vrax'thi, and never before by a non-vrax'thian. If he failed to convince them, the traditional penalty was unpleasant. Honored representatives of the vrax'thi High Command, Dave began, careful to use the correct honorifics. The human phrase cards on the table that I mentioned earlier has a deeper meaning. It comes from a game of strategy and deception. When players put their cards on the table, all pretense ends. That moment has arrived. He gestured to the Aurelian delegation. These representatives have orchestrated a campaign to prevent alliance between our peoples. They fear the combined potential of human adaptability and vrax'thi military precision. The lead Aurelian's eye slits narrowed dangerously. This is slander. We demand silence. Korg's voice boomed across the chamber. The right of She-Cree is in progress. Interruption is forbidden. Dave nodded gratefully and continued. But their mistake was in underestimating both our species. They assumed humans are merely clever animals, too self-interested to recognize manipulation. They assumed the vrax'thi are merely disciplined warriors, too rigid to adapt to deception. He looked directly at Admiral Korg. They were wrong about both of us. And to prove it, I will now demonstrate what humans do best: improvise. With that, Dave activated the second program Korg had helped him prepare on his datapad. The room screens filled with images from the vrax'thi equivalent of social media, what translated roughly as the Hunt Share network, displaying thousands of comments and reactions from ordinary vrax'thi citizens discussing the ongoing negotiations. The Aurelians believed they were manipulating official diplomatic channels, Dave explained. But they failed to consider how public opinion has already embraced the possibility of human vrax'thi cooperation. The people of both our worlds are ahead of the politicians. He tapped his datapad again, bringing up translation analysis of popular vrax'thian entertainment channels, where human cultural exports, particularly action movies and competitive cooking shows, had become unexpected hits. And while officials were being misled, Dave continued, gaining confidence. Cultural exchange was already happening organically. Did you know that Die Hard is the most watched human entertainment product in vrax'thi space? Or that human chefs are now competing in vrax'thian culinary combat arenas? This last bit was news even to Admiral Korg, whose antennae twitched in evident surprise. The chamber had fallen completely silent. Dave knew he was in uncharted diplomatic territory, but there was no turning back now. So here is my proposal, speaking under the protection of the right of She-Cree, he said, addressing both delegations. Let us bypass the compromised negotiators entirely. Let Admiral Korg and Ambassador Ortega, who was misled but not complicit, draft a new treaty based on actual mutual interests rather than Aurelian manipulations. The lead Aurelian diplomat finally lost his composure. This is absurd. You cannot simply. He never finished the sentence. Moving with frightening speed, the diplomat's aide had drawn what appeared to be a ceremonial dagger and lunged toward Dave. What happened next occurred so quickly that Dave's brain processed it only in fragmentary images. Admiral Korg's massive form intercepting the attacker, a spray of blue Aurelian blood arcing through the air, the screams of the human delegation, the clicking battle cries of the vrax'thi security team as they surrounded the remaining Aurelians. And somehow, inexplicably, Dave found himself holding the Aurelian's severed appendage, something between an arm and a tentacle still clutching the ceremonial dagger. Well done, language human Dave. Korg's voice boomed with what sounded disturbingly like pride. You have completed the rite of vrax'thi with traditional blood proof. The room erupted into vrax'thi in applause, a thunderous clicking sound made by rapidly striking four claws together. Dave stared at the alien limb in his hand, then at the applauding vrax'thi, then back at the limb. This, he said faintly to no one in particular, was definitely not covered in translator training. 3 days later, Dave sat in what had formerly been Minister Jackson's office, staring at his new credentials with a mixture of disbelief and mild horror. The holographic ID card displayed his image alongside the newly created title, Special Diplomatic Liaison to the vrax'thi High Command. "So let me get this straight," he said to Ambassador Ortega, who was looking considerably more relaxed now that the treaty had been successfully renegotiated. "I'm being promoted 5 pay grades, given diplomatic immunity in 17 star systems, and assigned as humanity's primary contact with the most militaristic species in known space?" "Correct," Ortega confirmed cheerfully. "The vrax'thi specifically requested you." Admiral Korg was quite insistent. "Because I accidentally completed some ancient blood ritual." "The rite of vrax'thi isn't just any ritual, Mr. Mendez. It's rarely invoked even among their own kind. For a non-vrax'thi to successfully complete it, well, you've made quite an impression." Dave rubbed his temples. "An impression?" "Right. Is that why I've received 16 marriage proposals from prominent vrax'thi warrior clans?" Ortega had the decency to look slightly embarrassed. "Yes, well, apparently displaying both linguistic skill and combat prowess makes you quite the catch in their society." "I've been advised that a polite decline is acceptable, though." "Good to know," Dave muttered. The door chimed, and Admiral Korg ducked through the human-sized doorway, his exoskeleton gleaming under the office lights. "Language human Dave." "I bring news from the High Command." Dave rose to his feet, still unaccustomed to the fact that he was now on first-name terms with the military leader of a species that, until recently, most humans had found utterly terrifying. "Admiral Korg, always a pleasure." "The treaty has been ratified unanimously," Korg announced. "Earth will receive full technical assistance with dilithium extraction, and vrax'thi military academies will begin accepting human cadets next stellar cycle." "That's excellent news," Ortega said warmly. "Indeed. And as a personal token of appreciation, the High Command wishes to present Diplomatic Liaison Dave with a ceremonial gift." Korg gestured, and a junior vrax'thi officer entered carrying an ornate box. With solemn ceremony, the officer presented it to Dave, who accepted it with appropriate gravity. Inside, nestled on ceremonial fabric, lay what appeared to be a ritual dagger, not unlike the one the Aurelian assassin had wielded, except this one was crafted from some iridescent material that seemed to shift colors as it caught the light. "This is a KR-Vac blade," Korg explained, "traditionally given to those who have proven themselves worthy of speaking hard truths. The inscription reads, 'Words cut deeper than blades, but sometimes blades make the best punctuation.' It's beautiful." "Bias," Dave said, genuinely impressed despite the somewhat disturbing implications of being gifted a ritual weapon. "Please convey my deepest gratitude to the High Command." "You may do so yourself," Korg replied. "You have been invited to address them at the annual Warriors Conclave on Centauri Prime." Dave nearly dropped the ceremonial dagger. "Me? Address the High Command?" "Of course. Your exploits have become quite popular on the Hunt Share network. The recording of you holding the severed Aurelian limb while covered in blue blood has been viewed 800 million times. Dave closed his eyes briefly. "I'm a viral sensation on alien social media." "Wonderful." "Indeed," Korg continued, oblivious to Dave's dismay. "There is even talk of creating a dramatized entertainment series based on your experiences. I believe the working title translates to the translator who speaks with blood." Ambassador Ortega couldn't quite suppress her laugh, which she hastily converted into an unconvincing cough. "Just to be clear," Dave said carefully, "I don't actually want to make a habit of the whole blood and violence thing. I'm really more of a words person." Korg's mandibles clicked in that now familiar laughter. "Of course, language human Dave. But you have taught us something important, that sometimes the most effective communication happens beyond words. You humans call it actions speak louder than words, yes? Something like that, Dave agreed. Then perhaps what we have created is not just a treaty, but a new form of understanding. A universal language of mutual respect. Korg's compound eyes gleamed. Besides, the next time you accompany me to negotiations, potential opponents will think twice before challenging the blood-soaked translator of Centauri Prime. As Admiral Korg departed, Dave turned to Ortega with a look of mild panic. Next time? There's going to be a next time? Oh yes, Ortega confirmed with a smile that contained equal parts amusement and sympathy. The vrax'thi have specifically requested your presence at all major diplomatic functions moving forward. Apparently you're what they call a luck bringer. Dave looked down at the ceremonial dagger, then at his new credentials, and finally at the small splatter of dried blue Aurelian blood that he'd missed on his sleeve. All I wanted was a quiet job translating technical manuals, he said to no one in particular. If it helps, Ortega offered, your new salary includes hazard pay and an excellent dental plan. I'm told vrax'thi ceremonial functions can be vigorous. Dave couldn't help but laugh. Somehow, in the span of 3 days, he'd gone from overlooked translator to galactic diplomatic linchpin, all because he'd been in the wrong place at the right time with an inexplicable knack for alien languages and an even more inexplicable talent for accidental heroism. Well, he said, carefully placing the ceremonial dagger back in its box, at least I'll have some interesting stories for my retirement party. Assuming I live that long. As if on cue, his datapad chimed with an incoming message, a meeting request from the Arcturian trade delegation, who were apparently now eager to establish better relations with the human who impressed the vrax'thi. Dave sighed and accepted the request, then paused as another notification appeared, this one from his old supervisor in technical translation. I don't suppose I could still finish those thruster manual translations in my spare time? Dave asked hopefully. Just to stay grounded? Ortega laughed. You can try, but I suspect your calendar is about to get very crowded. The Andorian Consortium has already inquired about your availability, and the Rigelian High Council wants to know if you'd consider mediating their territorial dispute with the Tau Ceti Republic. Mediate an interstellar territorial dispute? Dave shook his head in disbelief. I can barely mediate which takeout restaurant my roommates and I order from. The universe works in mysterious ways, Ortega said with a philosophical shrug. Sometimes the right person for the job isn't the one with the most impressive resume, but the one who can adapt when everything goes sideways. Just then, Dave's personal communicator buzzed. He glanced at the screen and groaned. What now? Ortega asked. My mother, Dave explained, showing her the message. Apparently she saw the news broadcast about the treaty signing. She wants to know if Admiral Korg is single, and if I can put in a good word for her. Ortega's professional composure finally cracked as she dissolved into laughter. Oh my, she managed between breaths. I believe vrax'thi mating rituals involve ritual combat and the exchange of exoskeletal fragments. I'll be sure to mention that in my reply, Dave said dryly. He looked out the viewport at the vast expanse of stars, pondering the bizarre turn his life had taken. You know, when I was a kid, I wanted to be an adventure novelist, write stories about heroes exploring strange new worlds. And instead, you became the hero, Ortega observed. Dave shook his head. I'm no hero. I'm just a translator who was too stubborn to die and too curious to keep his mouth shut. In my experience, Ortega said with a knowing smile, that's precisely what makes someone a hero in this vast, complicated universe of ours. As if to punctuate her statement, a priority alert flashed across Dave's new diplomatic console, an incoming transmission from vrax'thi Prime. Taking a deep breath, Dave straightened his slightly blood-stained uniform jacket and pressed the accept button. Language human Dave. Admiral Korg's voice boomed from the speaker. We have an urgent situation developing in the Procyon system. Hack your KR-VAC blade and your translation matrix. The diplomatic shuttle leaves in 1 hour. Of course, Admiral, Dave replied with a resignation that was slowly transforming into something like acceptance. One question, should I bring extra shirts? The last one got rather messy. Korg's rumbling laughter filled the room. Always practical, language human Dave. Yes, bring many shirts. Where we are going, there may be much punctuation. As the transmission ended, Dave exchanged a look with Ortega that contained equal parts trepidation and exhilaration.